On the desert coast of Peru, where the land seems almost too dry to remember anything, a river cuts a narrow green wound through the sand. From above, this is a world of ridgelines and dust, pale brown stone, empty horizon. Somewhere beyond it, unseen, the Pacific waits. There's no sound here but wind moving over rock and the faint, distant suggestion of water somewhere below. It does not look like the beginning of anything. You're looking at the place where a civilization began, one of the oldest in the Americas. And if that surprises you, it should. Almost nothing about this landscape announces it. But look closer, and the desert floor stops being empty. Here, 5,000 years ago, people built one of the earliest urban worlds in the Americas. Not a village, not a campsite. Cities, with platform mounds rising from the valley floor and wide, sunken circular plazas built into the earth like open mouths turned toward the sky. Staircases climbing toward flat, ceremonial platforms. Terraces catching the last light of the afternoon sun, the way they must have for thousands of years before anyone alive today was born. Walk through it today, and the silence is almost total. No traffic, no crowds, just wind, stone, and the occasional bird crossing overhead. It is easy, standing here, to forget that this emptiness is recent. For most of this valley's history, it was full. They rose here, in this valley, long before the Inca ruled these mountains, long before the great Maya cities filled their plazas with carved monuments. This valley was rising at almost the exact same moment Egypt raised its first great pyramids, and yet no empire, no dynasty, and no written history would preserve its name. And when archaeologists finally began to understand what they were looking at, they found something stranger than an old city. They found an absence. No readable texts naming kings. No carved victory monuments. No defensive walls rising from the desert. No obvious battlefield story. And yet, cities. There is a story we think every civilization has to tell. A ruler rises. A war is fought and won. A victory is carved into stone so no one forgets who triumphed. A written language appears, if only to record debts and laws and the names of the powerful. It is a story so familiar that we rarely stop to ask whether it is the only way the story can go, or simply the version that happened to leave the loudest evidence behind. Here, on this stretch of Peruvian coast, most of that is missing. There is no dynasty we can name, no conquest we can point to, no written narrative we can read. What survives instead is quieter and in some ways harder to explain. Mounds of earth and stone built by enormous coordinated labor for reasons the builders never explained to us and never had to. They did not build for us. They built for each other and for whatever it was they believed was watching. So the question this valley leaves behind is not simply how old this place is. It's this: what if civilization did not begin with war, kings, and writing, but with gathering, ritual, exchange, and memory? To understand this valley, we have to go back before Caral existed at all. A coastline of hunters and fishers, a handful of river valleys cutting through one of the driest coastal desert regions on Earth, and a question that mattered more than any other long before the first platform mound was ever raised. Why here? To understand why a civilization rose here, you have to understand what here actually is. This stretch of coast is one of the driest deserts on Earth. In places, rain does not fall for years at a time. Not because the sky is empty of ocean nearby, the Pacific is right there, close enough to smell, but because of the ocean itself. A cold current runs along this coastline, pulling icy water up from the deep. That cold water chills the air above it, and cold air does not rise, does not gather into storm clouds, does not fall as rain. To the east, the Andes finish the job, blocking whatever moisture might drift in from the Amazon. The result is a coastline squeezed dry from both directions at once, a desert wedged between an ocean and a mountain range, neither of which will give it water. But the same cold current that starves this coast of rain does something else entirely to the ocean itself. It feeds it. Cold water rising from the deep carries nutrients up with it, and nutrients bring life. Plankton, then fish, then more fish than almost anywhere else on the planet. This is one of the richest fishing grounds on Earth, sitting directly against one of the driest deserts on Earth. Life and near-lifelessness, side by side, separated by nothing but a shoreline. And cutting through that desert, a handful of rivers run down from the Andes, carrying seasonal runoff and rainfall gathered somewhere else, in mountains far away. Where those rivers reach the coastal plain, they carve narrow green corridors through the sand, valleys of soil and shade in a landscape that offers almost none. Desert, ocean, river valley, three worlds pressed together into a few dozen kilometers. Walk a few hours in one direction, and you cross from barren sand into fields dense enough to hide a person standing among the crops. Walk the other way, and the green disappears again just as fast, swallowed back into dust. Nowhere in this landscape is abundance more than a short distance from scarcity, and every community here would have understood that boundary intimately, because crossing it wrong could mean the difference between a good season and a hard one. People had been living across this landscape for a very long time before anyone built a single platform mound. Human presence along the Peruvian coast and highlands stretches back well over 10,000 years. Hunter-gatherer groups moving through a country of extremes, from sea-level desert to mountain passes thin on air, leaving behind stone tools and, in a few remarkable places, the remains of their fires and shelters, buried under centuries of wind-blown sand. Along the coast, communities built their lives around fishing, nets, hooks, and the sea's abundance. In the valleys, others were learning to work the soil, coaxing food from narrow bands of green. Higher still, in the mountains above, hunting and gathering communities moved with the seasons, adapted to thin air and colder ground. Three different ways of surviving, three different relationships with the land. For generations, their lifeways differed, coast, valley, highland, until exchange began to bind them together. But the desire to mark a place, to build something that outlasted the people who built it, did not begin at Caral. It began earlier and in smaller ways, all along this coast. Farther north, in the Zanya Valley, farmers were already digging irrigation canals more than 5,000 years ago, moving river water into fields by hand, coordinating labor across an entire community for a harvest. None of them would necessarily live to see repeated many times over. Along the coast, small ceremonial platforms and gathering mounds were already rising at sites like Banduria and later, further south, at El Paraíso, one of the largest pre-ceramic complexes ever built on this coast. One of the oldest known monuments anywhere in Peru, a carved frieze at a site called Sechin Bajo, in a different valley and a different culture entirely, not part of the Caral-Supe world, has been dated to well over 5,500 years ago, long before Caral's first stone was laid. It is not this civilization's monument, but it tells us the impulse to build something permanent, something meant to be seen, was already alive on this coast long before Caral gave it its fullest expression. The instinct was already here. What was missing was scale. We know some of this in remarkable detail, not because anyone here left behind an account of their own lives, but because the desert itself preserved what a wetter climate would have destroyed. Shell middens, mounds of discarded shellfish, built up meal after meal over generations, mark where coastal communities returned to the same fishing grounds again and again. Preserved textile fragments, some of the oldest cloth ever recovered anywhere in the Americas, have survived at nearby pre-ceramic sites along this same coast, protected for thousands of years by exactly the aridity that makes this landscape so hard to farm. The dryness that punishes agriculture is the same dryness that hands archaeologists an almost unheard-of gift, a record that does not rot. Archaeologists still argue about which of these worlds came first, whether the earliest push toward complexity came from the coast, where the ocean's abundance alone might have been enough to support large, settled populations without any farming at all, or from the river valleys, where irrigation and cultivated crops did the heavier lifting. One influential theory, sometimes called the maritime foundations model, argues that the sea came first, that fishing communities, flush with an almost unlimited protein supply, were the ones who first had the surplus, the free time, and the population density to begin building monuments, long before agriculture became central to anyone's life here. A competing view points to evidence that inland and coastal centers were developing in parallel at roughly the same time, neither one clearly leading the other, suggesting that this was never a story of one origin point radiating outward, but of two different environments experimenting with complexity at once and eventually finding each other. It is not a small disagreement. It touches something close to the center of how we think civilizations begin at all. Does surplus food from the sea create complexity on its own? Or does complexity require the discipline of agriculture, fields, canals, seasons, planning? The honest answer, based on the evidence so far, seems to be neither alone. What makes this debate matter beyond academic circles is what it implies about how civilization itself begins, everywhere, not just here. If the maritime model is right, then a society can be pushed toward complexity by abundance alone, by having so much food that some people can stop searching for it and start building something else instead. If the inland model is right, then complexity may require more than abundance. It may require the discipline of managing scarcity, of planning a season ahead, of building canals that only pay off months after the labor is spent. Caral sits at the exact meeting point of both ideas, which may be precisely why it refuses to settle the argument. What was missing, more than anything, was a reason for these separate worlds, coast, valley, highland, to start relying on one another. That reason may have been simpler than it sounds. Cotton was a valley crop, grown where river water could be managed. On the immediate shoreline, fishing settlements could not grow it easily, or at the scale inland valleys could, but they needed it badly. It could grow in the valleys, where the rivers ran, and cotton could be woven into the nets that coastal fishers needed to pull food from the sea. One valley crop tying two worlds together, inland farmers and coastal fishers, each holding something the other could not produce alone. A fisher without nets is just a person standing at the edge of an ocean. A farmer without fish is working some of the least protein-rich soil on the planet. Neither world alone explains what came next. Together, they might. It is not the whole story, but it may be where the story starts. Somewhere in these desert valleys, in the exchange between people who fished and people who farmed, the foundations were laid for something none of them could have predicted: cities, rising out of a landscape that, by every reasonable expectation, should not have been able to support them. That is where we go next. By the time the first great platform mounds rose at Caral, this valley had already been home to generations of builders. But nothing before it had reached this scale. At the heart of the valley stood 6 pyramidal mounds, arranged around open plazas and ceremonial spaces, organized into 2 halves, Caral Alto to the north and Caral Bajo to the south, following the Andean upper/lower logic archaeologists call Hanan and Hurin. On one side, monumental complexes, each built around its own pyramid, its own plaza, its own cluster of residences, as though the city had been organized less like a single settlement and more like a constellation of related communities sharing one valley floor. On the other side, more modest residential buildings, smaller mounds, and one structure archaeologists came to call the Temple of the Amphitheater, a name that hints at what it may have been used for, without ever quite explaining it. The largest of the 6 mounds, later given the name Piramide Mayor, dominated the city's ceremonial core, built into the slope of the valley so that it rose to different heights depending on where you stood. Its southern face, the shorter side, still climbed several stories. Its northern face, looking out over the valley itself, rose taller still, closer to the height of a 10-story building. With a base covering an area close to 4 football fields side by side, it did not go up all at once. Layer by layer, phase by phase, it grew over generations, each new addition built directly on top of the last, as though the city itself were something closer to a living thing than a finished structure. Ramps and staircases connected its different levels, and its summit, reachable only by climbing, overlooked the entire valley below. Nearby, sunk into the earth rather than raised above it, circular plazas opened downward, wide stone amphitheaters, some of them dozens of meters across, reached by stairways cut into their walls. Stand at the bottom of one today, and the desert wind seems to change its voice, gathering and echoing in a way it does not on open ground. It is not hard to imagine what these spaces were for, even without a single written record to confirm it. People gathered below the sky, looking at each other rather than up at a ruler. Some researchers who have studied the placement of Caral's buildings have proposed something else too, that the city's layout was not arbitrary, but oriented deliberately toward features of the surrounding landscape and sky. If true, it would mean the people who built this valley were not only organizing labor and food. They were reading the horizon, tracking the movement of the sun across the seasons, and building their most important structures in conversation with it. None of this was built with metal tools. None of it used the wheel. Workers built retaining walls of cut stone, hauled from quarries sometimes more than a mile away, and then filled the space behind those walls with something almost absurdly simple. Woven bags of reed, called shikra, gathered from grasses in the highlands above the valley, stuffed with rock and rubble, and packed into place. Trench after trench, wall after wall, stacked layer upon layer until a hillside became a mountain of human design. It is a strange kind of monument, invisible labor, hidden inside the walls of something built to be seen. No one walking past the Pyramid Mare today can see the thousands of individual reed bags holding it together. They were never meant to be seen. They were meant to hold. And there is something almost poignant in that technique once you sit with it. This civilization's most permanent achievement was built from one of its most temporary materials. Reed decays, cord frays. And yet, packed in darkness and pressed under stone, that fragile material has outlasted almost everything else this culture made, simply because it was never asked to face the sun. Caral itself covered more than 60 hectares, a sprawling ceremonial and residential landscape of stone, earth, and open plaza, home at its height to a population in the low thousands. But Caral was never alone. Across 4 river valleys, Huaura, Supe, Pativilca, and Fortaleza, archaeologists have identified more than 20 major centers built in this same tradition during the same centuries, and by some counts, the true number may be higher still. Coastal fishing settlements like Aspero, where some of the earliest signs of this culture's ceremonial architecture appear, and Banduria, further down the coast, following the same basic pattern of platform mounds facing the sea. Inland storage sites, where archaeologists have found the remains of large stone warehouses at some centers, buildings meant to hold something valuable at scale, long before anyone here had a word for wealth in the way we'd recognize it. Smaller centers scattered up and down the valley floors, each with its own version of the same architectural language: platform mounds, sunken plazas, and a relationship to the land that looks deliberate, even from a great distance in time. Taken together, researchers studying the wider Norte Chico region have suggested the combined population across all these valleys may have reached into the tens of thousands, an extraordinary concentration of people for this period anywhere on Earth, let alone in a landscape this dry. That population was not evenly spread. It clustered around ceremonial centers, drawn together by whatever combination of economic need, shared belief, and social obligation held this world together. Some historians call this constellation of settlements Norte Chico. Others prefer Caral-Supe, centered on the valley where the largest and most extensively studied city stood. The disagreement over the name is really a disagreement over a deeper question. Was this one civilization, or many communities, bound loosely together by a shared way of building and a shared set of beliefs? Even the archaeologists who first identified how old this place truly was have not always agreed on how to answer that. The history of Caral's rediscovery is itself a story of competing claims and competing interpretation, a genuine, ongoing, scholarly disagreement among researchers who have spent entire careers here, each reading the same stones and reaching different conclusions about what kind of society actually built them. That disagreement is not a footnote. It is a sign of how much this valley still has left to reveal, and how careful we should be about pretending the story is fully settled. What is certain is the scale of coordination it required. Raising a single platform mound like the Pyramid Mayor meant organizing labor across months, maybe years, gathering stone, cutting it, hauling reed from the highlands, weaving thousands of shikra bags, moving all of it into place, again and again, for generations. Some of the largest construction phases appear to have happened quickly, in intense bursts of activity rather than slow accumulation. The kind of effort that does not happen by accident or by casual agreement. Someone had to plan that. Someone had to convince people to keep showing up, season after season, harvest after harvest, for a project that might outlive them. And they had to do it without coercing an unwilling population into decades of unpaid labor. Or, if they did, they left behind none of the evidence that kind of coercion usually leaves. No mass graves of workers driven too hard. No evidence of violent suppression. Whatever compelled this labor, it appears to have been sustainable enough to keep working for a very long time. Who that someone was, a ruler, a council, a religious order, something else entirely, is a question the architecture raises far more easily than it answers. But before we can ask who held this world together, we have to understand what actually sustained it, day to day, season to season, in the ordinary work of staying alive in a desert. Two economies met in this valley, and neither, by itself, fully explains the scale of what came next. On the coast, communities like Aspero built their lives around the ocean, hauling in anchovies and sardines by the netful, gathering shellfish along the tide line, taking seabirds where they nested on rocky points above the waves. The same cold current that made this coastline so dry made its waters extraordinarily alive, and the people who understood how to work that abundance could feed far more mouths than the desert itself could ever support on its own. Dried and preserved, that catch could travel inland, up the valley, feeding people who had never once seen the ocean that produced it. Inland, in the valley itself, farmers worked narrow bands of irrigated soil, coaxing squash, beans, guava, sweet potato, avocado, and other crops out of ground that would otherwise be sand and stone. Sweet, dense fruits like lucuma and pacay grew alongside chili peppers and gourds, carried by canals that redirected the river's flow into fields that would otherwise have stayed barren. Whether maize played a significant role this early is still debated among researchers. Some traces of it have turned up at coastal sites, but most agree it did not become a true dietary staple here until centuries later. This was not a society organized around a single grain, the way so many early civilizations elsewhere were. It grew what the valley allowed and relied on trade to fill in what it couldn't. And running between both worlds was a single plant that mattered more than almost anything else grown here: cotton. Cotton could not feed anyone, but cotton, spun and woven, became the nets that coastal fishers needed to pull their catch from the sea. It is one of the clearest working theories archaeologists have proposed for how these separate worlds became dependent on one another. Inland communities growing the material that coastal communities needed to survive. Coastal communities pulling in the protein that fed people who never saw the ocean. A textile economy holding together a food economy, thread by thread. Spinning and weaving would have been constant, quiet work, done by hand, likely by many hands, turning raw fiber into cord, then cord into net, then net into the difference between a good catch and an empty one. Not the only explanation, but a compelling one. Think about what that means, practically. This society chose, deliberately and at scale, to dedicate some of its most valuable irrigated farmland, land that could have grown more food, to a crop that could not be eaten at all. That is not a decision a hungry, precarious society makes lightly. It suggests a level of confidence in the system as a whole. Confidence that the fish would come, that the trade would hold, that growing cotton instead of squash on this particular field was worth the risk. Someone was doing that math, season after season, and getting it right often enough for the system to survive for 1,000 years. Archaeologists have a name for this stretch of history: the cotton pre-ceramic. For roughly 1,000 years, the people of this valley built monumental cities, organized complex trade, coordinated large-scale labor, and never once fired a piece of pottery. No clay vessels, no ceramic tradition at the center of daily life. The technology that, almost everywhere else in the world, is treated as one of the clearest signs that a society has crossed some threshold into complexity. That absence, on its own, once led some researchers to assume Caral had to be a much younger site than it actually was. They were wrong. The city was already old before anyone here had ever touched a kiln. Instead of clay, this civilization built its material culture almost entirely out of plant fiber: cotton, reed, and gourd, woven textiles, fishing nets, the shikra bags that held their pyramids together, even, it seems, their memory. Among the objects recovered at Caral is a quipu, a length of cord, with smaller knotted strings hanging from it, capable of recording information through knots, color, and position. Some researchers who study these devices believe they may have carried far more complexity than a simple tally, possibly even something closer to a structured code, capable of holding information the way a written sentence does. That idea remains debated. What is not debated is that a system existed here for holding onto information across time and distance, built entirely out of string, at a site contemporary with some of the world's earliest writing traditions in Mesopotamia and Egypt, but recording that information through an entirely different medium, one that used no carved signs or written characters. That same basic technology, the knotted cord, would go on to become one of the most important administrative tools in the Andes, still in use thousands of years later under the Inca. We cannot read what Caral's quipu says, not the way we read a text. But it was made to hold meaning, and someone here likely knew how to use it. It is worth remembering how unlikely it is that any of this survived at all. Cord, cloth, and reed do not usually last 5,000 years. In almost any other climate on Earth, this quipu would have rotted away long before archaeologists ever had the chance to find it, and this entire chapter of the story would simply be missing. One more silence added to a civilization already defined by silence. It survived here only because the same brutal aridity that made farming so difficult also happens to be one of the best preservation environments on the planet. The desert that nearly prevented this civilization from existing is also the reason we know anything about it at all. Life in this valley was not only work. Archaeologists have recovered dozens of musical instruments from Caral's ruins, 32 tubular flutes made from pelican and condor bone, 38 cornets carved from deer and llama bone, and a handful of panpipes, some decorated with the carved motifs of monkeys, birds, snakes, and human-like figures. Radiocarbon dated to the centuries when this city was still at its height. Somewhere in these plazas, music was played. Whether for ceremony, celebration, mourning, or something we don't have a word for, we can only guess. But the instruments themselves survive as proof that this was a society that made room for sound, for gathering, for something beyond the pure mechanics of survival. There is even evidence, still debated and still cautiously interpreted, that this valley reached outward, that goods from far beyond the Supe made their way here. Spondylus shells, prized across the ancient Andes, that could only have come from warm waters far to the north near Ecuador. Dyes and materials that may have traveled down from the highlands. It is a picture that should be held loosely. Much of this research is still ongoing, and claims about the true reach of Caral's trade networks deserve real caution. But even the cautious version of the story suggests a valley that was never as isolated as its desert setting might imply. It is worth pausing on what this world did not have, because the list changes how everything else should be understood. No draft animals capable of hauling the loads that oxen or horses managed elsewhere in the ancient world. Llamas existed in the highlands, but at nowhere near the scale needed to move stone by the ton. No wheeled carts, no large-scale metallurgy. Every stone in every pyramid, every reed bag, every basket of earth moved because a human being carried it. The economy of cotton and fish that sustained this valley was not simply feeding people who admired their monuments from a distance. It was feeding the very hands that built them. Food, trade, a system for remembering. Music, played in spaces built for gathering. All of it sustained a growing population, valley by valley, without a single written record explaining how or why any of it worked as well as it did. Somewhere, someone decided when a platform mound would be built, how large it would be, and who would show up to build it. The evidence for that kind of authority is written into the architecture itself. Some of Caral's largest structures appear to have gone up not gradually, over generations of small additions, but in a small number of intense building phases, the kind of effort that suggests real coordination, not spontaneous community habit. Someone was setting a timeline. Someone was organizing supply, stone from the quarries, reed from the highlands, food for the workers doing the lifting. At another Norte Chico site, archaeologists found the remains of large stone warehouses, structures built for storing something valuable at scale. Cotton is one strong candidate. The same crop that tied the coast and the valley together may also have been the resource that gave whoever controlled it real leverage over both. Whoever managed a warehouse like that managed access to something other communities genuinely needed, and needing something from someone else is very often where power quietly begins. There is also evidence at some sites of feasting, gathering, food, music, the kind of event that could reward loyalty as easily as it could celebrate it. The flutes and cornets recovered from Caral's ruins may have been part of exactly this kind of occasion, a way of turning hard labor into something closer to a shared celebration, binding people to the project, not through force, but through belonging. And in parts of Caral, the layout itself hints at separation. Some residences set apart from others, closer to the ceremonial core, built with more care, in ways that suggest not everyone in this society lived or was treated the same. So the architecture does suggest organization. It suggests, in places, real authority. The ruins show organization, but they do not easily show command. This is, in its own way, one of the hardest kinds of archaeology there is, trying to reconstruct a political system from the shape of buildings and the placement of storerooms, with no text to check your answer against. Everything here is inference. A warehouse suggests control, but does not prove it. A cluster of finer residences suggests inequality, but does not tell us whether that inequality was inherited, earned, granted by ritual role, or something else altogether. Archaeologists are, in a very real sense, reading a society's political structure the way you might try to read a person's personality, entirely from the layout of their house, having never met them and never heard them speak. And here, the picture becomes harder, not simpler. The absence of walls and weapons does not mean an absence of violence. At Aspero, the coastal city that traded cotton and fish back and forth with Caral, official excavations at a temple mound, archaeologists came to call the Huaca de los Sacrificios, uncovered something else: human remains, including children and an infant, placed deliberately within the architecture itself. The official excavation report notes marks of blows on the skulls, suggesting they were sacrificed and offered. Not warfare, something else: ritual violence, folded into construction and offering, difficult to reconcile with any comfortable version of this story. It is worth sitting with. Caral-Supe may not have left behind the evidence of conquest we expect from later states. That does not mean power here was gentle, or that ritual asked nothing serious of the people living under it. What it does not offer is a name. There is no inscription anywhere in this valley identifying a ruler, no royal tomb loaded with regalia and a title. Archaeologists who have spent decades studying this civilization still disagree, sometimes sharply, about how centralized this authority actually was. One influential view treats Caral as something close to a genuine state, a society that produced real economic surplus, organized its members into layers of differing status, and was directed by an authority with enough power to make its decisions stick. In this reading, the pyramids and plazas were not just religious architecture, but the visible machinery of an early government, a way of turning belief into obedience and obedience into labor. A more cautious view questions how far that word, state, can really be stretched to fit what has actually been found. This reading points out that much of what looks like central command could just as easily be the product of shared ritual obligation, cooperative labor, and community consensus. Different valleys, different centers, each organizing themselves in loosely similar ways, without any single figure standing permanently over the whole system. In this version, the coordination we can see in the architecture came less from command and more from a deeply shared set of beliefs about how things ought to be done. Both views are supported by serious, ongoing research. Neither has definitively won. Anthropologists have long used a rough ladder of terms to describe how human societies organize power. Bands, small and kin-based. Tribes, somewhat larger but still loosely organized. Chiefdoms, with real inherited authority but limited coercive reach. And states, with centralized power capable of enforcing its decisions across an entire population. Caral does not sit comfortably on any single rung of that ladder. It has the scale and the monumental ambition of a state. It has, in places, the kind of hierarchy and elite privilege associated with a state. But it lacks nearly every physical marker archaeologists usually rely on to confirm one. No standing army's traces, no evidence of coercive punishment, nothing resembling a legal code. Every framework built to classify ancient societies elsewhere in the world was built without a place like this in mind. Part of what makes this debate so difficult to resolve is the same absence we opened this story with. In most early civilizations, questions about power get easier to answer the moment you find the first royal image, a carved face, a name in a cartouche, a tomb built for one person and no one else. Here, there's nothing like that to lean on. No portrait, no individual name, no burial dramatically richer than every other burial around it. Whatever this society believed about leadership, it did not believe in leaving behind a face for us to recognize. Compare that to almost anywhere else in the ancient world, and the silence becomes even stranger. In Egypt, the answer to who was in charge often arrives on the very first wall you find, carved deliberately so it could never be missed. A name, a crown, a god's blessing resting visibly on one particular head. Here, after decades of careful excavation, that wall has never turned up. Either it was never built, or this civilization simply never felt the need to answer the question the way its distant contemporaries did. The sunken circular plazas may be where the answer, if there is one, comes closest to the surface. These were not private spaces. They were built for gathering, wide, open, stepped down into the earth so that everyone inside could see and be seen by everyone else. If Caral's architects really were tracking the sun and the horizon in how they placed their monuments, then these gatherings were not just social. They may have been timed to the sky itself, ceremonies bound to the turning of the seasons, repeated on a rhythm no single ruler could claim credit for setting. Whatever held this civilization together, it seems to have needed people to show up, together, again and again, in spaces built for exactly that. Not a throne room, a gathering place. Maybe that, more than any king's name, is the real answer to how power worked here. not through a single voice commanding from above, but through ritual, repetition, and a shared reason to keep meeting in the same circular space, generation after generation. Power, if it existed here in the way we usually imagine it, may have worn a very different face, quieter, more communal, harder for us to recognize because it never needed to announce itself the way conquerors and kings elsewhere always did. It is worth sitting with how unusual that actually is. Almost every civilization we know how to talk about, we talk about through the language of its rulers, the reign of this king, the dynasty of that queen, the empire built by one particular name. That language does not work here. There is no reign to date this civilization by, only a landscape and the evidence of what people, together, chose to build in it. That system held in one form or another for well over 1,000 years. Then the water began to fail. Around 4,000 years ago, something changed in the climate of this region. The details are still debated, and the exact mechanism is not fully settled. But multiple lines of evidence point towards severe environmental stress affecting both river valley agriculture and coastal life, a system that depended entirely on a handful of rivers carrying water down from the mountains. Some researchers connect this to broader shifts in Pacific climate patterns, changes in the same ocean currents that had made this coastline both a desert and a fishery. As those patterns shifted, the composition of the fishery itself appears to have changed too, favoring different, smaller species and requiring different methods to catch them, forcing the people who depended on the sea to adapt their techniques, even as the people who depended on the rivers watched the water grow less reliable year by year. When the water becomes unreliable, everything built on top of it, farming, trade, ritual life, the rhythm of an entire valley, becomes unreliable too. And Drought may not have been acting alone. Some researchers studying this period point to a compounding cycle of environmental stress along this coast: powerful earthquakes, sudden and violent El Niño flooding events, and the slow reshaping of the coastline itself, as sand dunes and beach ridges shifted and encroached on land that had once been farmable. A civilization built on the narrow margin between desert and river did not need a single catastrophe to unravel. It needed only for that margin to narrow again and again until the system built to survive it could no longer keep pace. The great platform mounds at Caral were eventually abandoned, not necessarily in a single dramatic collapse. The evidence points more toward a slow unraveling, a gradual loss of the prestige and centrality this place had once held. The city that had organized labor across an entire region, that had drawn cotton from the valleys and fish from the coast and turned both into monuments, stopped being the center of anything. But abandonment of a city is not the same as the end of a civilization. And Caral was not alone in feeling this pressure. Across the wider Norte Chico region, many of the great centers that had defined this world for 1,000 years saw similar contraction around the same broad window of time. A pattern spread across 4 valleys, not a single failure isolated to one city. Whatever stressed this landscape did not stress it selectively. Some of the people who once lived by Caral's rhythms appear to have moved on, to new settlements built in the same tradition, carrying forward practices, beliefs, and forms of organization that had taken more than 1,000 years to develop. One of those places was called Vichama. It stood where the valley met the sea, a city built on both fishing and farming, occupied in the centuries after Caral's decline. And on its walls, archaeologists found something Caral itself never left behind: images, carved reliefs showing gaunt, emaciated figures, their ribs visible, their faces hollow. A visual record of scarcity that needs no translation across nearly 4,000 years. A scene some researchers have called the dance of death and life, showing figures caught somewhere between suffering and survival. Fish, carved alongside the human figures, as though even in crisis, the memory of abundance was worth preserving in stone. Figures that appear to be pregnant women, positioned near images of scarcity in a way researchers have read as a statement about continuity. Life persisting, deliberately depicted in the middle of hardship. And, strangest of all, a toad struck by lightning, an image that, in later Andean tradition, is closely tied to water and to the return of rain after a period without it. For a civilization that spent most of its history leaving almost nothing behind in the way of images or explanation, Vichama's reliefs feel like something close to a confession, a record carved into stone of hunger, of loss, and, perhaps, of hope that the rain and the rivers would return. It is one of the closest this long tradition ever came to telling us, in images rather than words, what crisis may have felt like. Further inland, another settlement called Peñico tells a related story. Built later, and on a smaller scale than Caral at its height, Peñico still carried forward the older architecture. Temple platforms, sunken circular plazas, the same ceremonial instincts that had shaped this valley for 1,000 years before it. Peruvian archaeologists studying the site describe it as a city of social integration, a meeting point where people from the coast, the valley, and the highlands beyond continued to gather, trade, and take part in a shared way of life, even after the world that built Caral had changed beyond recognition. Recent excavations at Peñico have uncovered a ritual offering, roughly 3,800 years old, that researchers say shows a direct continuity with the older traditions of Caral. The same forms of ceremony, the same underlying beliefs, still being practiced by people living centuries after the civilization that first gave those beliefs their shape had already faded from prominence. It is a small find, physically, but it is evidence, strong enough to matter, that whatever this valley believed in did not simply vanish when its greatest city fell quiet. Someone, generations after Caral's pyramids had stopped growing, still knew what an offering here was supposed to look like. Centuries after Caral's height, people here still practiced recognizable ritual forms. The names Caral, Vichama, and Peñico do not describe three separate stories. They may describe one long story, moving through crisis, adapting, and continuing in forms its founders never could have predicted. So, did this civilization end? Its greatest city was abandoned. Its water, for a time, became less reliable. Something was genuinely lost here, a scale of ambition, a center of gravity that this valley never fully recovered. But its traditions, its forms of ritual, its architecture, its instinct to gather in circular plazas built into the earth. All of that persisted, carried forward by people who never knew they were living in the aftermath of something later civilizations would call the oldest in the Americas. Did Caral-Supe collapse, survive, or become something else? Maybe the honest answer is that it did all three. And maybe that is the real answer to the question this valley asked at the very beginning. What if civilization did not begin with war, kings, and writing, but with gathering, ritual, exchange, and memory? Here, in the end, it seems it did not need any of the usual things to survive either. It needed people willing to keep gathering, to keep exchanging what each side of the valley had that the other did not, to keep carrying memory forward in cotton, in string, in carved images of drought and rain, long after the reasons for any single ritual were themselves forgotten. That, in the end, might be the truest legacy of Caral-Supe, a reminder that a civilization can be built and can endure, not through conquest or written command, but through ritual, obligation, exchange, and memory, and the difficult bonds that kept people returning to the same sacred places, generation after generation. Somewhere beneath the modern towns of the Supe Valley, beneath the Pan-American highway that now cuts near the ruins, the platform mounds are still standing, worn down by 5,000 years of wind, but standing. Tourists walk the same terraces once climbed by people organizing a harvest, a ceremony, a burial none of us will ever know the details of. The sunken plazas still gather sound the way they always did. And somewhere in the desert around them, unexcavated, unread, more of this civilization story is almost certainly still waiting. Buried not under stone, but under sand that has kept its secrets for longer than most of human history has existed to ask questions at all. Thank you for drifting with us tonight. New journeys every week.